Hello students, in this video we will summarize part 1 of the essay Introduction to the Empire Writes Back. The essay begins like this. More than three quarters of the people living in the world today have had their lives shaped by the experience of colonialism. It is easy to see how important this has been in the political and economic spheres, but its general influence on the perpetual framework of contemporary people is often less evident. Literature offers one of the most important ways in which these perceptions are expressed, and it is in their writing and through other arts such as painting, sculpture, music, and dance that day to day realities experienced by colonized peoples have been most powerfully encoded and so profoundly influential. The authors of this essay are of the opinion that more than 75% of world population have been affected by colonialism. The impact of colonialism is clearly visible in political and economic fields, whereas it is not so clear on the contemporary people. To understand what impact colonialism has had on contemporary people, we must read the literature concerning that period. Literature is one of the most important ways in which these perceptions are expressed. The colonialized people express their day to day experiences through their writing or through other forms of art such as painting, sculpture, music, and dance. Then the authors take up the question, what are post colonial literatures? According to them, the term post colonial covers all the culture affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day. So, when we look at the term post, it means after. Colonial means the rule of Britishers in the case of India. So, the literal meaning of post colonial is after the rule of Britishers has ended. But the authors of this book they define it as the time when colonization started to the present day. It is not from 1947 to the present, but it is from the time when colonization started to the present day. This is because there is a continuity of preoccupation throughout the historical process initiated by European imperial aggression. We have to take it in that span because once we were colonized, the impact of colonization continues to be there with us even when our colonial masters have left. They suggest that this is the appropriate term for the new cross cultural criticism which has emerged in recent years and for the discourse through which this is constituted. So, as per the authors of this book, post colonial is the appropriate term. It is the term which is best suited for the literatures which is coming out of all these countries. The book Empire Writes Back is concerned with the world as it exists during and after the period of European imperial domination and the effects of this on contemporary literature. So, how the world was at the time of colonization, how it was during the colonization, and how it is now after colonization. All this comes under the purview of post-colonial literature. So, which countries, literatures of which countries comes under this umbrella term? So, according to them, literatures of African countries, Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, Caribbean countries, India, Malaysia, Malta, New Zealand, Pakistan, Singapore, South Pacific countries, Sri Lanka, all the literatures of these countries come under post-colonial literature. So, next question they try to answer is, why is the literature of USA not considered as post-colonial? According to the definition they have given, the literature of USA should be placed in this category, but they are of the opinion that literature of USA should not be included because of its current position of power, because it is a powerful nation while the other post-colonial countries are still struggling to come out of the grips of colonial power. Next, it has been practicing neo-colonialism on other countries. So, because of its role played by USA, it cannot be considered as one of the post-colonial nations. So, its post-colonial nature has not been generally recognized, but its relationship with the metropolitan center as it evolved over the last 2 centuries has been paradigmatic for post-colonial literatures everywhere. What each of these literatures has in common beyond their special and distinctive regional characteristics. Now, we have seen the names of all the countries which come under this category of post-colonial literature. So, the authors are of the opinion that their experience of colonization and the self assertion by themselves. This is what we find in the essay. What each of these literature has in common beyond their special and distinctive regional characteristics is that they emerged in their present form out of the experience of colonization. All of them had this experience of colonization, and then they asserted themselves by foregrounding the tension with the imperial power. So they stood up for their causes, and by emphasizing their differences from the assumptions of the imperial center. So, whatever the center or the metropole had belief, they stood against it. It is this which makes them distinctly post-colonial. So, if the characteristics of post-colonial literature, we are to see, these are the characteristics: experience of colonization, self-assertion, and emphasis of their difference from the assumptions of imperial center. Now, next, the authors of this essay look at the English studies, the nature, scope of English studies in post-colonial countries. The authors of this essay show a connection between colonialism and introduction of English language. The study of English has always been densely political and cultural phenomena, a practice in which English and literature have both been called into a service of a profound and embracing nationalism. This development of English as a privileged academic subject in the 19th century Britain finally confirmed by its inclusion into the syllabuses of Oxford and Cambridge and reaffirmed in the 1921 Newbold Report, came about as part of an attempt to replace the classics at the heart of the intellectual enterprise of 19th century humanistic studies. See, here the authors say that English was not even the medium of instruction at England before 19th century. It was only after the Newbold Report came, it began to be introduced into the syllabuses of Oxford and Cambridge. From the beginning, proponents of English as a discipline linked its methodology to that of the classics, with its emphasis on scholarship, philology, and historical study, the fixing of texts in historical time, and the perpetual search for the determinants of a single, unified, and agreed meaning. Historical moment which saw the emergence of English as an academic discipline also produced the 19th century colonial form of imperialism. Here, the authors means to say that there is a connection between emergence of English and imperialism. As the critic Gauri Vishwanathan has pointed out, uh, she has presented strong arguments for relating the institutionalization and subsequent valorization of English literary study to a shape and an ideological content developed in the colonial context, and specifically as it developed in India, where British colonial administrators, provoked by missionaries on the one hand and fears of native insubordination on the other, discovered an ally in English literature to support them in maintaining control of the natives under the guise of liberal education. So, according to Gauri Vishwanathan, there are two aspects here. The colonial administrators or the rulers, British rulers of India, were convinced by missionaries to introduce English education. And secondly, they were afraid of the disobedience or insubordination of Indians. So they introduced English language just to show that they are liberal in providing education. One is reminded of Lord Macaulay's minutes here, how he wanted to introduce English education. What was the purpose of it? It was to bring up a class of clerks, right? So the intention was different, but they were making a mimicry of themselves by introducing liberal English education in India. The purpose was to keep Indians under their control forever. It can be argued that the study of English and the growth of empire proceeded from a single ideological climate, and that the development of one is intrinsically bound up with the development of the other. So, the growth of empire and the English language introduction both are interconnected at the unconscious level, where it leads to the naturalizing of constructed values, uh, which conversely established savagery, native, primitive, as their antithesis and as the object of a reforming zeal. Now, the language, introduction of the language somehow constructed the values that the Westerners, the British, are humane, civilized, and overall they have good manners, whereas the natives are savage, primitive, superstitious, etc. A prevailing norm which enthroned at the heart of the formation of English studies as a template for the denial of the value of the peripheral, the marginal, and uncanonized literature was made as central to the cultural enterprise of empire as the monarchy was to its political formation. So, when the elements of periphery and the margin threatened the inclusive claims of the center, they were rapidly incorporated. This was a process, in Edward Said's terms, of conscious affiliation proceeding under the guise of filiation, that is, a mimicry of the center proceeding from a desire not only to be accepted but to be adopted and absorbed. It caused those from the periphery to immerse themselves in the imported culture, denying their origins in an attempt to become more English than the English. So, after the introduction of English language, the native people, Indians, for example, they were ignorant of their original culture and values. They began to imitate the British because they were educated in English. As post colonial societies sought to establish their difference from Britain, the response of those who recognized this complicity between language education and cultural incorporation was to break link between language and literary theory by dividing English departments in universities into separate schools of linguists and of literature, both of which tended to view their project within a national or international context. To this, the authors already give they give the example of Gugi Vatiago's essay, which we already have read, on the abolition of the English department, is an illuminating account of the particular arguments involved in Africa. John Dawker's essay, The New Colonial Assumption in the University Teaching of English, addresses similar problems in the settler colony context, describing a situation in which, in contrast to Kenya, little genuine decolonization is yet in sight. As Dawker's critic makes clear, in most post colonial nations, the nexus of power involving literature, language, and a dominant British culture has increasingly resisted attempts to dismantle it. Even after such attempts began to succeed, the canonical nature and unquestioned status of the works of English literary tradition and the values they incorporated remained potent in the cultural formation and ideological institutions of education and literature. So, the impact that English has over the lives of people, the colonized people, is something which cannot be removed easily. Nevertheless, the development of post colonial literature has necessitated questioning of many of the assumptions on which study of English was based. Development of post-colonial literatures. Post-colonial literatures developed through several stages which can be seen to correspond to the stages both of national or regional consciousness and of the project of asserting difference from the imperial center. During imperial period, writing in the language of imperial center is inevitably, of course, produced by a literary elite whose primary identification is with the colonizing power. Thus, the first phase of post-colonial literature that will be that will have the following characteristics. The first text produced in the colonies in the new language are frequently produced by representatives of imperial power. So who are the representatives? Gentrified settlers, travelers, sightseers, and Anglo-Indian and West African administrators, boxwalas, and even more frequently their main sabs. They all write about their experience of traveling and life in general in the colony. Such texts can never form the basis for an indigenous culture, nor can they be integrated in any way with the culture which already exists in the countries invaded. Despite their detailed reportage of landscape, custom, and language, they inevitably privilege the center, emphasizing the home over the native and metropolitan over provincial or colonial, and so forth. So, the first phase, if we can call it that way, of post colonial literature will be mostly written by Europeans or the representatives of Europeans. So, in this type of literature, they give more importance to their home and to the metropoles. At a deeper level, their claim to objectivity simply serves to hide the imperial discourse within which they are created. That this is true of even the consciously literary works which emerge from this moment can be illustrated by the poems and stories of Rudyard Kipling. For example, in the well known poem Christmas in India, the evocative description of a Christmas day in the heat of India is contextualized by invoking its absent English counterpart. Apparently, it is only through this absent and enabling signifier that the Indian daily reality can acquire legitimacy as a subject of literary discourse. So they almost all the time compare whatever their experience is in the colony to that of the mother nation. The second stage of production within the evolving discourse of the post colonial is a literature produced under imperial license by natives or outcasts. For instance, the large body of poetry and prose produced in the 19th century by English educated Indian upper class or African mission literature. So, this stage includes the writing of the educated masses of the colonized country. The producers signify by the very fact of writing in the language of the dominant culture that they have temporarily or permanently entered a specific and privileged class endowed with the language, education, and leisure necessary to produce such works. The Australian novel Ralph Rashley, now known to have been written by convict James Tucker, is a case in point. Tucker was an educated man. He wrote Rashley as a special privileged convict whilst working at the penal settlement at Port Macquarie as storekeeper to the superintendent. Written on government paper with government ink and pens, the novel was clearly produced with the aid and support of the superintendent. Tucker had momentarily gained access to the privilege of literature. Significantly, the moment of privilege did not last, and he died in poverty at the age of 58 at Liverpool Asylum in Sydney. It is characteristic of these early post-colonial texts that the potential for subversion in their themes cannot be fully realized. Although they deal with such powerful material as brutality of the convict system in Tucker's case, the historical potency of the supplanted and denigrated native cultures or existence of a rich cultural heritage older and more extensive than that of Europe, they are prevented from fully exploring their anti imperial potential. Both the available discourse and the material conditions for production of literature in these early post colonial societies restrain this possibility. The institution of literature in the colony is under direct control of the imperial ruling class, who alone license the acceptable form and permit the publication and distribution of the resulting work. So, texts of this kind come into being within the constraints of a discourse and the institutional practice of a patronage system which limits and undercuts their assertion of a different perspective. The development of independent literature depended upon abrogation of this constraining power and the appropriation of language and writing for new and distinctive usages. Such an appropriation is clearly the most significant feature in the emergence of modern post colonial literatures. In this big paragraph, the authors have told that there are three stages in post colonial literature. In the first stage, only the missionaries or British administrators or colonial officers, they write about Indian life landscape and their experiences. That is the first phase. In the second phase, the natives of a colony write, but they are under the strict supervision of the colonial powers. Therefore, their writing is not independent. So, independent colonial writing can only come out when the colonialists have left, when the colonial powers have left, and that is the third phase of post colonial literature.